You know that quiet feeling of not fully trusting the world, not trusting institutions, not trusting promises, not trusting that things will simply work out. You're independent, capable, self reliant, but somewhere underneath, there's distance. Not emotional coldness, just space. What if I told you this wasn't your personality? It was conditioning. Today, we're exploring the dark psychology that shaped Generation X. Not broken, not apathetic, not detached, but wired differently. And once you see it, your entire life story starts to make sense. Generation X grew up during a quiet collapse. Not a dramatic one, not something anyone paused life to explain. It happened slowly, in the background, while adults were busy surviving themselves. Divorce rates doubled. Single-parent households became normal. Both parents working full-time became necessary, not optional. Children came home to empty houses. They unlocked doors alone. They made their own food. They learned how to wait. Meanwhile, trust in governments, corporations, and long-term stability quietly eroded. And hanging over everything was the Cold War, the constant idea that the world could end at any moment. Not metaphorically, literally. There were drills for it, news segments about it, movies about it. Children absorbed the message without context. Nothing is guaranteed. And yet, no one said, "This might be scary. Let's talk about it." There was no emotional processing, just one unspoken rule: adapt. And Generation X adapted well. But adaptation always leaves a psychological imprint. Today, people often describe Generation X in simple terms: cynical, emotionally distant, skeptical, too independent. But that interpretation misses something essential. This wasn't rebellion, it wasn't attitude, it wasn't disengagement, it was survival. Their environment taught them a single lesson early: no one is coming to save you. And the nervous system listened. When a child internalizes that lesson, they don't become weak. They become self-contained. They learn to manage themselves, to minimize needs, to stay functional no matter what. Generation X didn't grow up with constant chaos or obvious abuse. They grew up with something quieter, something harder to point to: emotional absence. Parents weren't cruel, they weren't malicious, they were exhausted, overworked, emotionally overwhelmed. So children learned what not to ask for. They learned, don't ask for help. Don't expect emotional availability. Don't rely too much on anyone. Psychologically, this creates hyper-independence, a deep internal belief that says, I'll handle it myself. They learned how to self-regulate early, how to stay composed, how to not burden others. They learned to read rooms, to sense tension, to stay out of the way. But they also learned something else: that vulnerability often leads to disappointment, that expressing need doesn't guarantee care. So they stopped showing it, not because they didn't feel deeply, but because feeling openly felt unsafe. Being alone wasn't an exception, it was routine. Latchkey childhoods trained the nervous system daily. Coming home to an empty house teaches something fundamental: you are responsible for your own safety. This builds strengths: high awareness, emotional restraint, strong internal boundaries. But it also builds tension, a constant low-level vigilance, difficulty fully relaxing, a feeling that rest must be earned. Many Gen X adults don't even realize they're tense. They just feel normal. But their nervous systems are always scanning, always prepared, always managing. That's why autonomy often feels safer than belonging. Why authority is met with automatic skepticism. Why reassurance feels less valuable than competence. Their nervous systems were trained for self-management, not comfort. Then there was the media. Generation X grew up without filters. Graphic news, violence, war footage, disaster stories. Unsupervised television did emotional teaching adults didn't. Nuclear threats weren't abstract concepts. They were discussed openly, repeatedly, casually. Psychologically, this embeds existential realism early. They don't expect fairness, they don't expect safety, they don't expect systems to last. Hope to them often feels fragile. Optimism feels naive. Slogans feel manipulative. Blind faith feels dangerous. They don't panic easily, because they already imagined collapse long ago. This is where the misunderstanding happens. What the world calls detachment is emotional efficiency. What it calls cynicism is pattern recognition. What it calls emotional distance is resilience shaped by reality. Generation X doesn't need constant validation. They don't collapse when plans fail. They don't need reassurance to function. They function in uncertainty because uncertainty is familiar. Their strength is emotional self-containment. But that same strength has a cost. Connection doesn't come naturally when you learned early not to expect it. Boomers were loud. Millennials learned to express. Gen Z learned to speak openly. Generation X learned to stay quiet. Not because they didn't care, but because when they needed care most, no one was paying attention. So they adapted. They became observers, problem solvers, stabilizers, often holding families, workplaces, and systems together without recognition. They don't demand attention, they assume responsibility. If you're Generation X, hear this clearly. Your distance isn't coldness. Your independence isn't isolation. Your skepticism isn't negativity. It's intelligence shaped by experience. And the work now isn't to suddenly become expressive. It's not about forcing vulnerability. It's about choosing connection intentionally, instead of avoiding it automatically. You don't need to change who you are. You need to update what your nervous system believes, because the world you adapted to is not the world you live in anymore. There's another layer to this psychology that rarely gets talked about. Generation X learned early that emotions slow you down. When chaos is normal, you don't process feelings, you manage them. You keep moving, you stay functional, you don't stop long enough to fall apart. So many Gen X adults learn to intellectualize emotion. They think their feelings instead of feeling them. They analyze, they rationalize, they downplay. Not because they're disconnected, but because slowing down once meant things could get worse. This is why stillness can feel uncomfortable, why silence doesn't always feel peaceful, why rest sometimes feels earned only after exhaustion. The nervous system learned momentum as safety. It also explains their complicated relationship with authority. Generation X watched institutions fail quietly. Governments promised stability and didn't deliver. Corporations promised loyalty, then downsized. Adults promised security, but were absent. So trust became conditional. Respect had to be earned. Words meant less than actions. This isn't bitterness, it's calibration. They learned to measure reality instead of believing narratives, which is why manipulation rarely works on them. But it also means hope is approached cautiously. Another subtle effect is how Generation X relates to identity. They weren't encouraged to find themselves. They were encouraged to cope. So identity became practical, not expressive. What do you do well? What works? What's useful? Not, who are you emotionally? This is why many Gen X adults struggle later in life when asked to open up or be vulnerable. They were never taught that language. They were taught competence. And yet, beneath all of this, there's a depth many people never see. Because when Generation X does connect, it's not performative. It's real. They don't overshare. They don't dramatize. But when they commit to people, values, or principles, they stay. They're loyal, grounded, steady. They don't need to be seen constantly to remain present. The challenge now is learning that connection no longer equals risk. That needing others doesn't mean losing control. That rest doesn't require collapse first. That being supported doesn't make you weak. This isn't about becoming someone new. It's about allowing what was always there to surface safely. So ask yourself, where did I learn not to need anyone? Where did I learn to stay quiet? And where might connection actually be safe now? Because what you always thought was your weakness was never weakness. It was preparation. And now you get to decide what you do with it.